Greetings and welcome to our daily walk through the scripture for July the 26th. Your readings today find you in 2 Chronicles 19 and 20, Romans chapter 10, starting in verse 14 and going all the way through Romans 11:12, Psalm 21, 1 through 13, and Proverbs 24 through 6. Now, if you look at church history, one of the things that you will find surprising, perhaps, is that Christianity and Judaism didn't always have a healthy relationship. In fact, for a while in the early parts of the church, when it was forming in the 300 to 500 A.D. For the Christian church, there was a lot of animosity towards Judaism. They didn't like it, and as a matter of fact, they went out of their way to separate Christianity from Judaism. The holidays, for example, Jesus was crucified around Passover. Passover is an important part of the crucifixion of Jesus, and yet the church refused to recognize Easter as that time because they didn't want it being associated. They didn't want Jesus being associated with Jews. Now, this is a really ironic thing, and if it wasn't for mercy and grace and some of God and some foresight of church fathers, we might have had a completely separate holiday. But it's really ironic when you read a book like Romans and you see Paul's love for his people, for his Israelites. Then you look at it and you think, why in the world is would we hate them? Well, Christianity, again, in the early church was trying to figure out, what are we? Are we a part of Judaism? And finally the church recognized, no, we're not. And so just like we always do, there's a pendulum swing. And we can't do anything halfway or reasonable. We have to go from one extreme to the next extreme. And that's exactly what we did. Oh, no. We can't have anything to do with these Israelites. They're terrible. The Jews, we don't want to be a part of the Jews. They're the Jews. So we see this. But Paul is saying here that, look, you have to understand that Israel is going to have its moment. It's going to have its time. But for now, God has opened up the path of salvation for the entire world. And he says in chapter 11, verse 1, did God reject his people? In other words, did God reject Israel? And he says, no, absolutely not. And this is something that the church had forgotten at one point. Paul says, I'm an Israelite myself. God didn't reject his people whom he foreknew. Don't you know what scripture says? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left. And God answered him, I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed to the knee to Baal. Which this is Elijah, by the way, that he's talking about. So too, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. So here's the deal. Paul is saying the problem with the people of Israel is they're still consumed with the law. They're still consumed with trying to find the law, and they could not obtain it, as Paul says in verse 7. They couldn't find it. Yet the elect, Paul says, the remnant, they have found it. They have discovered who Jesus is, Paul being one of them. And so did they fall so far beyond recovery in verse 11? Again, we're talking about, we've been talking for the past few days about what the fate of Israel is when it comes to Christianity. Paul believes that they are going to get an opportunity to be reconciled with God, that Israel is going to come to a place where they are going to believe. He says so right here in verse 12. But if their transgression means riches for the world, their loss means riches for the Gentiles. How much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? In other words, Paul is looking forward to the day that Israel becomes reconciled finally, and they recognize that the law is not what they should be following, but instead they should be following the one true, only giver of grace, Jesus Christ. So what does this have to do with us? Well, we have to be very careful not to write off people that we think should be written off, that we think are beyond hope or past hope. Nobody is beyond God's reach. Nobody is beyond God's choosing. We have no idea who God has called to be his elect or not. And that is not our concern. Our concern, however, is to continue to be the hands and feet. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Sounds like familiar reading today. We need to make sure that we are continuing to do that. There are a lot of Calvinists in the world that believe that, irresistible grace, and hyper-Calvinism says there's no point in evangelism because God's going to save who God's going to save. Well, that is true. God's going to save whom God's going to save. However, God very clearly calls us to go and to make disciples. We don't know who God is going to save. That's not for us to worry about. Our job instead is to be the hands and feet. Nobody is beyond saving. God will call whom God is going to call. How much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? All right, that's it for today.